I agreed to house sit for my aunt for 2 weeks, and on day 3 discovered she had an entire secret garden behind a locked gate in the backyard that none of the family had ever known existed. My Aunt Rosalind is, by any reasonable measure, the most interesting person in our family. This is not a competitive field. The rest of us are accountants, teachers, one mid-level project manager, and my cousin Derek, who sells insurance and has strong opinions about golf. Rosalind is a retired botanist who spent 20 years doing fieldwork in places most of us couldn't find on a map, came home in her early 50s to a house she'd bought sight unseen before one of her longer trips, and has lived there quietly and entirely on her own terms ever since. She doesn't explain herself much. This is not rudeness, just a settled quality, the manner of someone who stopped needing external approval a long time ago and has been much happier since. Family gatherings, which she attends selectively, usually involve her sitting in a corner being genuinely interesting to whoever is brave enough to approach her, and politely impenetrable to anyone trying to pry. My dad calls her eccentric. My mom calls her private. I've always just called her Rosalind, because that seems like the most accurate thing. I'm 26, my name is Mara. I had just finished a contract job that had run its course and had 2 weeks between that and the next thing, which in practical terms meant I had 2 weeks of unexpected freedom, and not quite enough money to do anything ambitious with it. When Rosalind called and asked if I would house sit, the timing was almost too convenient. She was going to Portugal. A former colleague was getting married, and Rosalind, who generally treated invitations as optional, had apparently decided this one wasn't. She would be gone 14 days. She needed someone to water the plants, collect the mail, make sure the old house didn't do anything a house shouldn't do while she was away. She asked if I wanted to stay there rather than drive back and forth, said the guest room was made up, said she'd leave instructions. I said yes without hesitating. I liked Rosalind's house. I had visited it twice before, and both times had come away with the feeling of a place that had been lived in with real intention, every room arranged with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had thought carefully about how she wanted to spend her time. Books everywhere, not decoratively but actually used. A kitchen that took cooking seriously. A garden visible from the back windows that I had always found beautiful in a slightly overgrown, uncurated way, the kind of garden that looked like it had been left to develop opinions of its own. She left on a Sunday morning. I arrived Sunday afternoon with a bag and a week's worth of food. She had left a handwritten list on the kitchen counter, 2 pages meticulous, covering the plants, the quirks of the heating system, the neighbor's name in case of emergency, the vet's number for a situation I hoped would not arise involving the hedgehog I had not known she kept. I read through it carefully and felt, for the first time in weeks, usefully occupied. The first 2 days were quiet and genuinely restorative. I worked on some freelance writing I'd been neglecting, cooked real meals, slept well in the guest room which had a window that looked over the back garden, and let in the morning light at exactly the right angle. I watered the plants according to the schedule on the list. I fed the hedgehog, whose name was apparently Clement, and who regarded me with the specific suspicion of an animal that knows you are not the person who is supposed to be there. On the 3rd day it rained in the morning and cleared by afternoon. I decided to spend some time in the garden, not working on it particularly, just being outside after 2 days mostly indoors. I pulled on my jacket, made a coffee, and went out through the back door. Rosalind's garden was long and slightly wild, the way I remembered it. Raised beds along one side that had clearly been productive earlier in the season. A large apple tree at the far end dropping the last of its fruit. Paths of old brick that curved in ways that seemed more intuitive than planned. It was the kind of garden that rewarded slow walking, which is what I was doing. I had been out there maybe 20 minutes when I reached the far end, past the apple tree, and noticed something I hadn't registered on my previous visits or from the window. The garden didn't end at the back wall the way I'd assumed. The wall had a section of old wooden fencing that ran perpendicular to it, extending perhaps 30 feet to the right, and in the middle of that fencing was a gate. The gate was not remarkable at first glance. Old wood iron latch, the same weathered quality as everything else back here, but it was closed with a padlock, a solid one, newer than the gate itself, and through the gaps in the wood I could see green, not the garden I was standing in, different green, denser, more deliberate. I stood at the gate for a minute looking through the gaps. There was definitely something on the other side. Plants taller than anything in the main garden, arranged in a way that suggested intention. I couldn't see the full extent of it. The gaps in the wood were narrow, and the afternoon light was coming from the wrong angle. I went back inside and looked at the instruction list again, carefully, all 2 pages. There was no mention of the gate, no mention of a second garden, nothing about a padlock or a key. I looked at the key hook by the back door, which had 3 keys on it, labeled in Rosalind's neat handwriting. Back door, shed, car, no 4th key. I looked up Rosalind's number and typed a message. asked if there was anything behind the gate at the far end of the garden she wanted me to check on. Then I put the phone down and waited. 3 hours later she hadn't replied, which was not unusual. Rosalind's relationship with her phone was famously casual. She would get back to me when she got back to me. In the meantime, I stood at the kitchen window, looking down the length of the garden toward the gate, and thought about the fact that I had been to this house twice before and never noticed it, that no one in the family had ever mentioned it, and that the padlock was newer than everything around it, which meant someone had put it there deliberately and not very long ago. I went to bed that night thinking about what was on the other side. Rosalind replied the next morning, one sentence, "Don't worry about the gate, everything in there is fine." I read it 3 times, then I typed back, "Is there a garden behind it?" She replied 4 hours later, "Yes, leave it be, enjoy the house." That was it, no explanation, no context, just leave it be. Said by a woman who had spent 20 years doing fieldwork in remote locations and had come home to a house with an entire section of the backyard nobody knew about. I put my phone down and looked out the window at the gate and felt the specific frustration of being told not to be curious about something that had already made me completely curious. I want to be honest here. I did not try to break in or force the lock or look up how to pick a padlock on my phone, all of which occurred to me. I respected the leave it be for approximately 2 more days. What changed was not impatience but accident. On the 5th day I was in the shed looking for a trowel because one of the raised beds had a section that was compacting and I wanted to loosen it. The shed was organized with the same deliberateness as the rest of the house, tools hanging on labeled hooks, bags of soil stacked neatly, seed packets in a small wooden box organized by type. I found the trowel. I also found, on a hook behind the door that I only saw when I pulled the door fully open to leave, a key on a plain ring with no label. I stood in the shed doorway holding it for a long moment. It was the right size for a padlock. I knew that before I walked over there, the proportions were specific. I told myself I was just going to check whether it fit, that if it did fit, I would lock it again immediately and put the key back and carry on with the trowel and the raised bed. I walked to the gate. I put the key in the padlock. It opened. I stood there with the open padlock in my hand and the gate in front of me and gave myself one more moment to decide. Then I pushed the gate open and stepped through. What was on the other side stopped me completely. It was a garden in the fullest sense of the word, not the slightly wild productive space I had been tending for 5 days, but something else entirely. Enclosed area maybe 40 feet by 30, surrounded on all sides by high stone walls I hadn't been able to see from the main garden. The walls were covered in climbing plants, some still holding green, others gone to rust and amber with the season. In the center was a circular bed with a stone path running around it. Along the walls were deep beds planted with things I couldn't immediately name, low-growing and dense, with a quality of having been tended with real precision. At the far end, against the back wall, was a wooden bench, old and smooth, with a shallow depression in the seat from years of use. Everything in there was alive and recently tended, not overgrown, not neglected. Someone had been here, not long ago. But the thing that stopped me, the thing that made me stand in the gateway for a full minute just looking, was the smell. It was extraordinary. A dense layered green smell, cool and slightly sweet, with something underneath it I couldn't immediately identify. It took me a moment to understand it was medicinal, not unpleasantly so, more like the smell of a very old pharmacy, herbs and earth and something faintly resinous. I walked in slowly, crouched down at one of the wall beds and looked at the plants close up. I didn't recognize most of them. Small-leafed, some silvery, some very dark green, a few with dried seed heads still attached. I took a photo with my phone, then another. Then I walked the perimeter slowly, photographing as I went. In the corner nearest the bench there was a small wooden cabinet, weatherproof, latched but not locked. I opened it. Inside were tools, small and specialized, the kind used for precise, delicate work. Pruning scissors with long, narrow blades, a small grafting knife, glass vials with rubber stoppers in a row, most of them empty but a few holding dried material, labeled in handwriting too small to read without squinting. A worn notebook with a cloth cover. I did not open the notebook. That felt like a line I wasn't going to cross, but I held it for a moment. It had weight, the specific weight of something that had been used for a long time. I sat on the bench. The wood was warm despite the cool afternoon, the way old wood in a sheltered space holds heat. I stayed there for maybe 20 minutes, not really thinking, just sitting in the middle of something I didn't have a framework for yet. The smell was still there. The walls blocked the wind entirely. It felt completely separate from the rest of the world in a way that was hard to account for physically, but was nonetheless very present. When I went back through the gate, I locked the padlock, put the key in my jacket pocket, and went inside. I typed a longer message to Rosalind this time. I told her I had found the key in the shed and had looked through the gate, and that the garden was clearly being tended, and asked if I should be doing anything in there while she was away. I kept it matter of fact. I didn't ask the questions I actually wanted to ask. She didn't reply that evening. I cooked dinner, fed Clement, sat with a book I wasn't fully reading, kept thinking about the smell and the notebook and the wooden bench with its depression worn into the seat. Her reply came just before midnight, longer than her previous ones. It said, I should have told you about it before I left. The plants in there need nothing from you, they're fine for 2 weeks. I'll explain when I'm back. I'm sorry for the mystery, it wasn't intentional. The garden is mine and it's important to me, and I'm not used to people being in the house when I'm away. I'll tell you everything when I get home. Don't worry about the notebook. I read that last line twice. Don't worry about the notebook. I hadn't mentioned the notebook. I didn't go back into the garden for the rest of the week. Not because Rosalind had told me not to, she hadn't this time, but because the message felt like a boundary I wanted to respect. She had said she'd explain when she got home. I decided to take that at face value and wait. But I did research. I'm a person who researches things when I don't have answers, always have been. I uploaded the photos I'd taken to a plant identification app and went through them one by one. The results were interesting. Several of the plants came back as medicinal herbs, not the common kitchen variety but older, less familiar ones, things with names I had to look up. Plants that had been used in European herbal tradition for centuries, some of them going back to medieval monastery gardens. A few the app couldn't identify at all, returning a low-confidence match or nothing. I found a botanist's forum online and posted 2 of the clearer photos asking if anyone recognized them. Within a day I had 3 responses from people who clearly knew what they were looking at. One of them identified a plant I hadn't been able to place as a variety that had been considered largely extinct in cultivated gardens for several decades. He asked where I had seen it. I said a private garden and left it at that. I sat with that for a while. A retired botanist who had spent 20 years in the field, living alone in a house with a locked garden containing plants that weren't supposed to exist in cultivation anymore. I wasn't scared exactly. More like I was standing at the edge of something that had more depth than I'd initially estimated. The remaining days of the house-sit passed in a quiet rhythm. I worked, I cooked, I tended the main garden, I fed Clement, who had graduated from suspicion to mild tolerance in my presence. I went back to the gate once and stood outside it without opening it, which felt like the right amount of restraint. Rosalind came home on a Sunday afternoon, exactly 14 days after she'd left. I heard her key in the front door and came downstairs to find her setting her bag down in the hallway, looking tanned and unhurried, the way she always looked, like she had an amount of time that other people didn't. She looked at me, I looked at her. You went in, she said, not accusatory, just stating it. I found the key in the shed, I'm sorry. She considered this for a moment. I probably left it there on purpose without realizing, she said, which was either very self-aware or very cryptic, and possibly both. Come and have tea, I'll tell you about it. We sat at the kitchen table with tea, and she told me. She had started the garden 11 years ago, shortly after moving into the house, as a research project she was conducting independently after retiring from institutional work. Not affiliated with any university, not published, not shared. Her own project on her own terms, which was how she preferred to work once she no longer had to answer to anyone. She had spent her career studying plant adaptation, specifically the way certain species responded to cultivation conditions over generations. The secret garden was, in her words, a living library. She had spent years sourcing specimens from botanical archives, private collectors, seed banks in 3 countries. Several of the plants in there were varieties that existed in only a handful of places in the world. A few she had propagated herself from material she had collected in the field over her career, seeds and cuttings carried home carefully over decades with the long view in mind. The notebook was a continuous record, 11 years of observations, measurements, growth patterns, seasonal changes. She had considered donating the project to a botanical institution at various points and had each time decided against it because she had seen enough institutional research to know what happened to things that got absorbed into bureaucracies. They got catalogued and underfunded and eventually quietly forgotten. So you keep it yourself, I said. So I keep it myself. Does anyone else know about it? She wrapped both hands around her mug. A colleague in the Netherlands, a woman I correspond with who maintains a similar garden, that's all. Not the family. The family, she said, with a specific gentle dryness, would not know what to do with it. I couldn't argue with that. I thought about Derek and his golf opinions. She had a point. I asked her about the plant the forum had identified as functionally extinct in cultivation. She smiled for the first time since she'd sat down, the particular smile of someone being asked about something they know very well. She took me out to the garden. Standing inside it with her was a completely different experience from standing in it alone. She moved through it the way people move through spaces they have shaped with their hands over years, unhurried, touching things occasionally, not for any practical reason but with the ease of long familiarity. She told me the names of things, the common ones and the Latin ones, and occasionally an older name from a tradition before modern taxonomy. She told me where specimens had come from, a market in Morocco, a monastery garden in Portugal, a retired schoolteacher in rural France who had been maintaining a particular variety for 40 years, and had given Rosalind a cutting from it as if passing on something sacred. She showed me the plant from the forum. It was smaller than I'd expected, low-growing, dark-leafed, completely unremarkable to look at. She said it had taken her 6 years to get it to propagate reliably. Why, I asked, what's it for? She looked at me with an expression that was amused and considering at the same time. It's not for anything specifically. It existed. It was disappearing. Someone should keep it. We stayed out there for almost an hour. The afternoon light was going golden the way it does in October, coming in low over the top of the stone walls and landing on everything at a soft angle. She sat on the bench, and I sat on the ground beside one of the wall beds, and she talked about the garden with a fluency and precision that was like watching someone speak their first language after years of translation. At one point she said, without particular emphasis, that she had been meaning to document the project more formally for some time and hadn't found the right approach. I asked what she meant by formally. She said she wanted a written record that was more accessible than the notebook, something that captured not just the data but the context, the history of each specimen, where it came from, why it mattered. I told her I was a writer. She looked at me the way she sometimes did, like she was reassessing something. I know you are, she said. I could help with that if you wanted. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll think about it. That was 6 months ago. She thought about it for 3 weeks and then called me, which she almost never does, preferring messages or letters. She said she had decided yes if I was still interested, and that she wanted to start in the spring when everything was coming back in and easier to describe. I drove out in March with a notebook of my own. We spent the weekend walking the garden slowly, and I wrote down everything she told me while she talked about each plant the way you talk about things you have loved for a long time. By the end of the weekend, I had 40 pages of notes, and a strong sense that this was going to take considerably longer than either of us had initially estimated. Neither of us seemed to mind. The project is ongoing. I go out every few weeks. The garden has its own rhythm now in my life, seasons marking themselves through what's flowering or dormant or just beginning. Rosalind has started pointing out things she hadn't mentioned before, small details she'd held back initially, now sharing them with the ease of someone who has decided to trust. My dad asked recently what I kept going out there for. I said Rosalind and I were working on something together. He nodded vaguely and moved on, which is exactly what Rosalind predicted the family would do, and exactly why the garden has been hers alone for 11 years. Some things are kept private not out of secrecy, but out of care. A locked gate isn't always hiding something. Sometimes it's just protecting something that needs protecting until the right person happens to find the key. End of story.